Good morning. Oh, well, yeah, it's still morning. It's been a busy Monday. This is the regular meeting for the City of Eugene Planning Commission. It's Monday, January 30th. We start agenda item 1 with public comment. So the Planning Commission reserves 10 minutes at the beginning of this meeting for public comment. The public may comment on any matter except for items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record is already closed. So is there anybody from the public that would like to speak? I don't have a green sheet, but that doesn't mean you can't speak. No? Okay, you'll have another chance potentially at the end if you want to. Okay, agenda item number 2 from, oh, actually, do you want to do that? You want to switch it up?
Doesn't matter to me, your choice.
Why don't, okay, sure. Agenda items from commission and staff.
Oh, we're still waiting for Bree.
Oh, Bree, sorry, Bree is not coming.
Okay.
So Steve Baker, Commissioner Baker, and Bree Nicolello, Commissioner Nicolello are both out today. So agenda item 2, which is usually the agenda item at the end of the meeting, we're going to pull up. Are there any items for commission that are outside the agenda today? Yeah.
Outside the agenda.
Well, outside our main agenda item, which
I
is,
just had a question. During the presentation, will they update us on what the workshops have been saying so far?
We can do that. We can do that.
That's all my only question, is just
Perfect.
the feedback so far.
Sure.
do you want to wait to do that, or do you want to do that now?
Do it at the beginning of my intro.
Perfect. Okay. Any other items for commission? Oh, actually, Commissioner Baker has arrived. Great. Items from staff.
Nothing major, just wanted to let you know that really the only key item coming up soon for us for City Council is the February 22nd stop line at Next Steps. I've mentioned that before, so I'll just keep throwing it out there as a reminder. There were 2 annexations that went to council last week. Those were both approved. Those are going back to just be removed from the tax districts next week. Nothing big, just very routine. And March 8th, looking at a little farther, we have the commercial setback code requirements for downtown, which is an item that Councilor Zelenka polled about, which was concerned about what are the appropriate setbacks in our downtown for future development. So, oh, one other item. At our retreat, we did talk about there's a training called the Speed of Trust. And we just touched on that a little bit, and I was mentioning that I'd like to offer that to planning commissioners. I've been in touch with our training folks.
Right.
There's a session coming up in April.
Yeah.
So I'll be sending something out to you all to assess your interest and then figure out how we go about getting you signed up for that if you want to go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Question. I saw something too, that Measure 49 claim ended up extending the timeline. Have there been much comments on that, and are those going to be forwarded to the commission?
I'd have to look in to see what kind of comments we've received on that, but I think at this point, yes, it has been extended. So I think they're thinking about some alternatives. Don't know all the details on that.
Thanks.
Great, okay, and here's your opportunity. Sorry, I said it was going to be at the end of the meeting, but public. Do you have any comments? How are we doing? Planning Commission, feedback, anything? No, you're so, keep up the great work. Okay, thank you very much. Now to agenda item number 3, work session UGB adoption package. Terry Harding, lead staff, is going to talk on this item.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. Today begins our real preparation for having our public hearing on the urban growth boundary adoption package, which is set for March 7th. I'll tell you a little bit about, since I was asked, what's been happening at the community information sessions. And Heather can jump in if she wants to, because she's been at both of them, and I've been at one of them. But we've had 2, and we have 4 more scheduled, including one tomorrow night. And the turnout has been light, which is always a challenge, so any way you can think of to get the word out. Although we are also getting packets in the hands of community groups and leaders so that they can participate at their own meetings or online, however they want to. We have given a short presentation at each of the community information sessions and heard some of the key themes from folks, like questions about the expansion proposal is one kind of area of questions that we've heard. Do we have to expand onto farmland? If we do, how are we minimizing that? How are we addressing our impacts to farmland? Another key question has been, how are we accounting for new development? You know, since 2012, how are we wrapping that into our analysis and planning for that going forward? I think I'll stop there and just ask if there's anything else Heather wants to highlight.
Yeah, we did get some questions about housing and how we're addressing housing and housing affordability either now or in the future. Those were the other key topics I can think of.
So one thing that has occurred to us as staff is that we have a lot of materials. Obviously, we have this big notebook that's hard for the general public to wade through. So we have fact sheets and different ways to explain the information. We're also creating another shorter, easier cheat sheet, if you will, of those kind of key issues that have been coming up at the meetings. So that's in development right now. It's just meant to be another way for you to see kind of what's been coming up, how it's addressed in the proposal, and where you can find more information. So we're working on that. I also passed out this to the commissioners. This is a skinny packet of the 3 most recent city council meetings where they provided direction to staff on the urban growth boundary package. So this is our reference. It's the source of a lot of the material that's been prepared for the UGB package, starting with January 28th, 2015, where they provided us direction on how to plan for jobs, parks, and schools. And then July of that same year, how to plan for housing. And then most recently, October of 2016, how to plan for multifamily housing, a portion of it. So that's what that is. And you have this in your email as well. How we thought we would go through today is first recognizing that this is the first of 2 work sessions that are just with this body to go through the materials preparing for the public hearing. Lane County Planning Commission will have their own meeting, and then you'll have a joint meeting together right before the hearing. So those are the immediate next steps in your process. Our thought was today with Emily and Heather and some other staff that we have in the audience, we would literally walk you through what's in your binder so that you know where to find things and what all the tabs mean as you're preparing to go through this process. Does that make sense as a way to handle the meeting? Yes. We won't talk at you for giant lengths of time. We'll stop and make sure everything's tracking and making sense. But that was really how we were going to start.
Okay.
Emily
Thumbs up
gets to
from
start
everyone?
it off.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
So Terry asked that I kind of just provide a kind of a outline for the meeting, kind of give you a skeleton that these guys are going to flesh out as we go through each piece. And to tell you in a big picture way what you have in your binders, you have 2 ordinances in your binders. I actually just have one. This is the Jobs, Parks, and Schools ordinance. The reason it's organized the way it is because the first thing in here is the draft ordinance. These are all the exhibits to the ordinance. We like to have the exhibits run in a certain way. We always do comprehensive plan amendments first, then refinement plan or functional plan amendments, and then we do some zone, we go to code, and it kind of goes in that order. That's why they're ordered the way that they are. And in these, the order's a little bit different because as much as we could, we wanted to make sure the county ordinance and a city ordinance reference the same document the same way. So things get a little bit out of order, you know, from my type A lawyer tendencies, but there are reasons. So the first thing in here is the ordinance itself. The only thing I want to, now that you kind of know what's in here and why it is in here in this order, the only thing I really want to mention are really just one thing actually that's in the ordinance that isn't represented by one of the exhibits that we'll talk about today. Section 3 of the ordinance is a repeal of the Eugene Commercial Land Study. This is the old one, and the work that we're doing now would replace that. Everything else that's mentioned in here is we're going to talk about today because it's represented by some material that follows. So the exhibits that start with an A, there's A1, A2, A3, and A4 are all exhibits that relate to changes to the Metro Plan. The other kind of big picture thing I want to talk about before we get too far into this is that this is the ordinance that is establishing the Eugene urban growth boundary. You have to establish it in one way or another. It made sense to us to do it with the expansion. So this ordinance doesn't just deal with jobs, parks, and schools per se. It also deals with the drawing the line around the UGB that we already have to define it more clearly. We weren't required to define it very explicitly when we adopted it the first time. It does a lot of things that have that sort of big picture aspect to them. And we'll get right into that with the Metro Plan amendments. The Metro Plan amendments, A1, are the text amendments. And a lot of these amendments are to address the fact that there, after we take action, will no longer be a metropolitan urban growth boundary. There will be a Springfield urban growth boundary, and there will be a Eugene urban growth boundary. Springfield established its in 2011, and there's some language in the Metro Plan that already reflects that. So right now, the Metro Plan has references to Springfield UGB and Metropolitan UGB. What we're doing is making it clear there will still be some references to the Metropolitan UGB, but only in terms of historical discussion. So a lot of, there's not a lot of text change in here, but what it is doing is it's eliminating text that's no longer relevant once Eugene has its own UGB. And then the second, A2 tab, is a map that shows the boundary that is going to be added to the existing maps in the Metro Plan to illustrate where the Eugene UGB is. A3 is a table that Heather's going to talk more about, but it appears right here because one of the things this table does is it lists the tax lots that are being added to the urban growth boundary, and it provides their current Metro Plan designation and what their new Metro Plan designation will be. And that is illustrated on maps behind tab A4. The maps actually show the expansion areas and what their proposed Metro Plan designations will be if this ordinance passes. So Heather's going to talk a little bit more about that table, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing I would mention, I don't think you mentioned this, but in that table, what you'll see is, it has Metro Plan designation, current and proposed, and there's a key at the bottom, and this is separated by Clear Lake and Santa Clara, so they're both on the same page. And then the zoning districts and overlays, what you have is the current zoning, so that's the Lane County zoning. You have the zoning that's proposed at the time that we adopt the urban growth boundary, and that is ag for everything. And that's really intended to make sure that everyone understands that they're allowed to continue doing ag until that time in which they propose to annex, which, just for the public, we are not proposing to annex any property at this time. So that's the ag is kind of a holding zone, really. And then what you see is the proposed zoning upon annexation. So again, the proposed zoning is not happening at this time, the one upon annexation. That will automatically happen whenever they annex. And that zoning will have to be consistent with the proposed metro plan designation, which is listed there. And so we just want to be really, upfront about, what the zoning will be in the future. And then the overlays there on the right are all proposed at this time. So they are all proposed to happen with the ag zone, change to ag zoning. And then at the time of annexation, those overlays will all stay except for the UL overlay will go away. That's urbanizable land because at the time they annex, that goes away. And so like Emily was saying, the metro plan changes are shown on A4, and then this, I think, is the only time that we're going to ask you to skip ahead for just a minute and go to F, which says zone change maps. So that shows the first one that you see is Clear Lake proposed zoning upon adoption. That's upon UGB adoption, and it's ag. And then you see it for Santa Clara as well. And then when you go to G, the next tab, overlay zone, you see the overlay zones for Santa Clara and, Clear Lake and Santa Clara. Again, the overlays are proposed at this time with adoption of the UGB. The reason you don't see a map about what the zoning will be at the time of annexation is because it's not happening right now. But it's represented in that table. And I think that was all I was going to say about that.
Heather, what is,
Yeah.
just so you did UL when, what is CHS?
Sure, if you look, oh, right, so we need to add an overlay, yes, we need to add an overlay key at the bottom here, and we've done that for the public notice. Actually, that was something that helped us realize that we needed to do. So CAS is Commercial Airport Safety Overlay Zone, so that's about kind of making sure that whatever develops there doesn't conflict with the airport and height and other things like that. WQ is the Water Quality Overlay Zone, so there are some lots in the Clear Lake area that will get that, not all of them, but a few. And then also in the Santa Clara area. And then WR is the Water Resources. Nothing in Clear Lake is getting the WR, but in Santa Clara they are getting that. And then CL is the Clear Lake overlay, which only applies to the Clear Lake area. So thanks for mentioning that. That was the other thing I was going to mention.
Question on that. There was the need to preserve certain size parcels. Is that?
That's in the Clear Lake overlay zone, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the code amendments. But yeah.
So by application of that overlay zone to this area, the standards of that zone will apply.
Okay.
And is Zach here? Is he going to talk about that?
Yeah,
Really?
Zach is going to come down for that
Okay.
part.
Okay, so,
Do we want to do questions as you go along, or?
That makes sense to me, especially if they're clarifying questions. Absolutely, let's do them as we go.
And given the size too.
Yeah.
Okay, Commissioner Randall.
One that I think is pertinent to where we are now regarding the map and the UGB. It looks like, and just maybe clarify for me, because I think I've asked this before, and then maybe just for the public, the parcel-specific map is coming later, and that'll be in phase 2, I'll call it phase 2.
It is coming later, but with adoption of these lots will be parcel
That's
specific.
where I was going. It looked to me like you already have in here, those lots obviously are parcel specific, and
Yeah.
then there's in, I think it's Exhibit I, Appendix E, it talks about the method of going through along the boundary of the UGB, of making that then parcel specific, but that'll only apply to the boundary, is that right? And then all the internal blob maps, for lack of a better term, will come later.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Good clarification. Thanks.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I was just called the question to just clarify. So none of the lots are planned to have proposed with, upon annexation, to have a split zoning, commercial on one part and I-2 on the other. I just wanted to make certain that that was the case.
Right. Right. On the table, I think you see some of them have that right now, but they would not retain that split.
Yep. And let's see. Is that right? On the zoning map, you can see the tax lot lines, so that's a good double check. Oh, but I see what you're saying. It doesn't have to propose for later. Yeah, but no, I'm not aware that,
Like this covered in the table.
yeah.
So the next document or series of documents relate to the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan, which, as you know, is kind of a bare bones beginning to the city's city-specific localized comprehensive plan. It appears at B1, the plan itself. B2 is worthy of a bit of discussion. There's a, we know, unreadable map in here. And what it says at the top is representation of Exhibit B2, because actually the, oh, we're sharing this one.
Okay, sorry, I'll use this one.
B2 is actually going to be a compact disc. We have experienced over the many years working with the Metro Plan diagram particularly, some difficulties in determining where lines really are, because somewhere along the line, as a result of a LUBA appeal, we were told that all we can actually reference is the piece of paper that was attached to the ordinance when it was adopted. So what we are attaching to this ordinance at adoption is an electronic a shape file, for those of you who know what that is. That's a GIS layer that staff will be able to use, the public will be able to use as they need to really drill down and see the exact location of the line. And so that's why right here what we just have is a representation. We didn't produce the electronic copies for everybody at this point. When, I mean, are we gonna, I don't know if maybe at some point we can demonstrate for them how that works, or if somebody wants to, they could certainly contact Terry to check it out. And then B3.
What, back up.
Yep.
So at what point do we delve into our questions about the comprehensive plan and maybe making amendments?
The EECP, the Envision Eugene Comp Plan?
Yeah.
I think right now is a good time to talk about those. Let me introduce you to B3, and then we'll talk about all the stuff that's in the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan, then take questions on that. Is that good?
Yeah, that's good. In fact, just to kind of facilitate this going forward, if you guys can pause at those natural pause steps, and if we can just wait
Right.
and trust that they will pause at the right time to ask us questions. Yeah, perfect.
I don't mind being asked, though. It's okay.
Yeah, it's good.
So the biggest document in here is going to be an exhibit to the local comprehensive plan. It's the employment land supply study. And in fact, Terry, maybe you do, if maybe you do want me to address this after, if they have questions about the comp plan itself.
Because we're going to have Beth come up and
Yeah.
talk about the employment land supply study, so maybe we should.
I think that makes sense.
Okay.
So go ahead.
So back to the comp plan.
Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, and to me, this is, I mean, a lot of what we're going over here is in my view, non-amendable. You know, there are things that have been decided and going forward, but I think that a couple of the areas that I feel is my duty to overlook is the comp plan policies and then also the Clear Lake overzone or overlay zoning things. And if there's questions, I think those are areas that are open for discussion and possible adoption or revisions if needed. So in the comp plan, the large lot preservation, and I know we'll get to this when we get into the actual ordinance, but it's been a long time since we visited the Clear Lake overlay zone. And so I would just like to have staff explain that more to us. You know, it was, I could kind of get into it, but there were still some things about, if there's two of these ones that are done, then you can split it. So at that point, that was one of my highlighted ones. The other one that I think is important and that I think we need to have a discussion on is the growth monitoring program. The growth monitoring program to me right now, which I'm looking at let's see, what page would this be? A and 1, number 3. It's 10.1. Is very vague in my mind. I think that we've been resting our hats a lot on the fact that, yes, we'll pass this and we're going to do monitoring. That I've heard that a dozen times at all levels of this presentations. So if you look at the first bullet point, it says, provide an annual report on key data. The city manager says that. Provide an annual report. Okay, well, that's great, but that doesn't have any action behind it, except for to say, here's the report. Same thing with the 3-year one. Provide a comprehensive report 3 years after the Eugene specific urban growth boundary has been acknowledged by the state, and thereafter every 5 years. It seems to me that there should be a second part to that. And if required, and if significant changes are needed, direct city council. I don't know. I don't know what the language is, but the way it's written now, it's just like, we're going to monitor it, and I'm going to give you a report. And so, in my view, that's not strong enough language. And I would advocate for trying to get some sort of stronger language in there that is going to hold the city council accountable and the city manager to do what we have been talking about for the last 4 years with the monitoring program. And the language in here, in my opinion, doesn't do that.
So, certainly appreciate your views on this, and at some point we need to get them from all of you. I think what we want to do today is familiarize you with where things are in here. If there's time, I think if we get through the whole first ordinance and there's time to actually start talking about issues that you see like that and substantive, like changes you'd like to see or kind of deliberation type discussion, we should probably do that then. The marching orders for today really were for me to keep you on track with just sort of letting you know what's in here and where it is. And if you see something missing, or if you want to know where people are asking you about this, where do you find the answer to that? That's what we're going to try to do today. And at what point in time will it be the moment for, questions like Commissioner Borowski's?
Questions are always fair game. What I'm trying to help for you all and for the public to draw a distinction between our preparation for the public hearing and your deliberations, which happen after the public hearing, because this is the proposal that's going to hearing. So I think our main focus should be knowing where everything is, knowing what your questions are is helpful to us, but to the extent that, you don't like this or want to see things changed, that is coming out of all the listening that we're doing through the public hearings and then getting at those questions in the deliberation sessions.
All right.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I wasn't sure about that. I mean, we got the binder.
Totally.
We read through the binder. These are the
Yeah.
areas that I have concern.
Thank you. That was a great description. So I have two commissioners with questions, Commissioner Jaworski and then Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said, but I'd like to know if there's a way that, as Commissioner Borowski, if something could be done quickly, because it's very beneficial to me that I know now, even before we go into deliberations,
To highlight
that I'm going to look at
questions.
10.10,
Yeah.
and I know there's concerns on that. So if it
Yeah.
can be done super quickly, I'd like to know that so that I'm prepared in addition to what we hear at the public hearing.
So I think that makes sense. It's just understanding that right now we're not going to deliberate and have discussions on
I have
these.
concern on issues,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
can note it that other commissioners have something.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Baker.
I was going to suggest the same thing, but I wanted to make a suggestion on the map, on the GIS map.
Yeah.
Since you're providing a CD, I was just going to suggest for people that don't have the capability to use that GIS file, you just provide the 18 by 24, whatever it is, an image that would print out as
Yep.
just as a suggestion.
We'll have a couple of file formats.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I was suggesting.
And one of the things that you will see, the final version of the plan will have, how big is that paper map you want to
18 by
include?
24-ish.
Yeah, it's pretty big.
And it folds into a pocket. And it's not printed in this version, but that was our intent with the final comp plan, is that it would have a pocket for a fold-out UGB map that's much more legible than the little one in here.
And it would just include language that says, this is a reference copy. The official one is electronic, but I think that'll get at what you're requesting, Commissioner Baker.
And one more, just if we're following through that, I have some concerns about 10.8, because I don't see anything about the impact of industries on the neighboring residential, which we talked about a lot during the adoption process for this, so just.
And we'll get at some of how the Clear Lake overlay zone works, which addresses both of your issues a little bit later when we get to the code amendments. We'll walk you through it.
So this big document, which is would be an appendix to our local comprehensive plan, is the employment land supply study. And this is a very legalistic document and technical document. The bulk of it is a document called the EOA, which we will have our consultant come up and talk to you about. This is the document that I've walked you through a couple of different times, first at your retreat and then again at the last session we had together, that has first you start with 2012, that's part 1. Then, part 2 is figure out your needs. So this document is divided into 5 parts. If you want to become really familiar with it, I would recommend that you go ahead and put in tabs at each of the 5 parts. The most important part going forward, assuming this is adopted, will be the final part, which is part 6 in this document, which is the city's buildable lands inventory for employment land. And so if you think about how you might use this, how this may relate to what you do in the future, if in 5 years you're on the planning commission, somebody comes in and they want to change their designation to or from an employment designation, staff will need to first check whether or not we have a sufficient supply, whether or not that land is on our inventory, whether or not that land is not already on our inventory, and this will be the document that they check. So part 6 begins, these are each part is numbered individually, but part 6 is the last part in this document, and that's the one I think it's a real good document for you to look at. I will also say that we as staff, as we kind of work with this a little bit more, we find things that we want to do better, that we want to address, everything from typos to a useful table that should be there. And so we will actually be updating a few of these things in a detailed description to you, so if there's been, where we've changed things. But I do think this is one of the documents that we plan on adding a table to in part 6. So I think Beth should probably come up and walk through.
Actually, I'm going to walk through the parts really
Okay,
quick.
very
and then
good.
Beth, if you want to come up, and then I think there's a microphone here so we can do that. And are we not going to walk through the comp plan? I guess that was my other question.
Did you want to?
We certainly can.
Okay. We can go back to that if you want, but I just wasn't sure if we wanted to talk about the 4 different chapters or.
Well, we've got Beth. Let's go with this, and
Yeah.
then we'll come back to the comp plan.
So the way this is constructed is, as Emily mentioned, there's 6 different parts, and I think the main thing I just wanted to make sure it was clear is that part 1, and Emily kind of walked you through this a little bit, I think, earlier in one of the earlier presentations. Part 1 is a snapshot of what buildable land we had in 2012. And so as a result of that, there are maps in that section. But as Emily mentioned, those aren't going to be the maps that we're going to end up relying on when we go back and say, okay, what's our buildable lands inventory? But I just want to make sure, because that could be a little bit confusing. So 2012 says, what's our buildable land supply? Part 1 says, what's our buildable land supply? Part 2, Beth is going to talk about, which is the Eugene Economic Opportunities Analysis, fondly known as the EOA. So we really start with the 2012 supply, and then what is our 2012 through 2032 demand for jobs. And I'll turn it over to Beth, and then I'll go through the other parts.
Well, thank you for having me here. The first thing I wanted to talk about with the EOA starts with the purpose of it. Why are you doing it? So first, you're looking at understanding what your economic base was in 2012. So what do you have here now in terms of employment? What are your opportunities for business and employment growth going forward? We look at your buildable lands inventory, the one we started with in 2012, and determine if Eugene has enough land with the right characteristics. And characteristics are things like size of parcels, transportation access, topography, whether it's hilly or flat, all of those things. So do you have enough land to accommodate your growth? And then finally, the EOA serves as a factual base for your comprehensive plan policies. Your policies are connected to the information in the buildable lands inventory and the economic opportunities analysis, and serve as that base. So before I go on, do you have any questions about the purpose of the economic opportunities analysis? Okay. So what we did, Heather just talked about the buildable lands inventory that starts the EOA. So that's the inventory of land that you had in 2012. And then in the EOA, we start evaluating Eugene's opportunities for economic development and economic growth based on, in the context of long-term trends in the region and the state and the nation for economic development. Factors that are affecting economic development in Eugene. So for instance, your labor availability, your transportation access, the fact that we're here along I-5, the forecast for growth in Lane County by the state of Oregon, looking also at your economic base. So what industries does Eugene have employment in? We look at Eugene's competitive and comparative advantages within the city and within the context of the Southern Willamette Valley. So for instance, an advantage that you have is that you have sufficient water and wastewater capacity. You also have advantages from being along I-5. In comparison to other cities, say, we'll just take Corvallis for a moment, it's not along I-5. So that means that Eugene has different opportunities, just looking at that one factor, than Corvallis does. And there's a whole lot of other factors that we looked at having to do with Eugene's economic DNA, if you will. So we took all of these opportunities and understanding of Eugene's context, and we've summarized them in the document on Table 16. If you want a little bit of technical reading, Table 16 is a number of pages long and might be interesting for you to read, or it also might not be interesting for you to read. Certainly it summarizes the key points of the section before it. Page 66, so way in there. That's quite a long little table there, page 65, 66. And then we understood the types of businesses that might locate in Eugene and looked at their site needs. So when I say site needs, I mean what's the characteristics of land that they need. We started with some of the regional policies around economic development and the aspirations for types of businesses to grow, such as high-tech manufacturing or biomedical or certain types of professional services. The city is very much engaged in economic development policies to grow many of these types of businesses already. And you can see some information about the site needs of those businesses starting a little bit later in the document. And the types of businesses. Let's, where it's a little bit later. I will come back to that in a few moments. I noted down the wrong page for you guys to look at. Then we went to a forecast for employment growth, and that starts around page 92. And the key tables for the forecast of employment growth are tables 21, 22, and 23. And so essentially what we're doing is we're looking at how much employment Eugene has and then forecasting future growth of employment based on the county's forecast for growth of employment in Lane County. That's 1.4% average annual growth rate. So that helps us figure out how many new employees would be in Eugene by 2032. You guys have any questions before I continue on? Making you flip through pages, I know. So once we know how many employees Eugene would have, then we look at the land need, starting with the employment forecast, and then looking at some characteristics of development in Eugene already. So for instance, what's the density for employment development in Eugene? Industrial employment tends to have a different number of employees per acre, so a lower density than most retail and commercial development. So we started with information about densities in Eugene, and we built off of that and used assumptions for that to convert from number of new employees to acres of land. We also looked at employment that may locate in existing built spaces, so vacant buildings, infill into existing buildings, so adding a new desk into an office. So opportunities for using the existing built space a little bit better. And then we came to an estimate of how many sites, well, how much land and how many sites Eugene would need for different uses. So we did this for commercial, and we did this for industrial. And commercial industrial end up being fairly different in the types of land and amounts of land that they're going to need. So commercial, it starts on page 112, and we come to a conclusion about commercial land and how much land you're going to need compared to your supply of land by page 115 and table 29. And what it's showing us is that Eugene has 154 acres of vacant and partially vacant and potentially redevelopable commercial land, and there's demand for 248 acres of commercial land. So you've got a deficit of 94 acres of commercial land. So that's the results of the EOA for commercial land needs. Industrial ends up being a little bit more complicated and done a little bit different way because industrial businesses look at land differently and they have different site needs than commercial businesses do. So before I go on to industrial, do you have any questions?
So, we're getting back to this. So we showed a deficit, but we addressed that with efficiency measures, right? Okay.
Yes, Heather will be coming on to
Right.
those.
Okay.
Exactly. So industrial land demand insufficiently starts on page 116. And we look at land needs based on employment growth for sites that are smaller than 10 acres. In part, that's because Eugene has a lot of sites that are smaller than 10 acres. And in any city, finding sites smaller than 10 acres is generally easier than finding vacant sites that are larger than 10 acres. So we split off between sites that are smaller than 10 acres and sites that are larger than 10 acres. And that section runs from page 116 to page 125. And in tables 34, 35, and 36, we come to some conclusions. So table 34 tells us that you've got a surplus of land and sites for employment that are smaller than 10 acres. So you got a lot of those. And it's not surprising that you've got about 152 acre surplus there. Then we look at sites that are larger than 10 acres, and you've got a deficit of sites in all of those categories. That's shown in table 36. So you've got 495 acres, or 11 sites that you have a deficit of. And one might ask the question, well, why do we need some of these bigger sites? Why do we need sites that are 20 to 50 acres and some of the 50 acre and above? Well, Eugene has certainly lost some opportunities for employment growth. Some businesses have moved out of Eugene in response to the lack of sites in this size. And it's not just lack of sites in the size, but it's lack of sites that have urban services easily available to them, that have transportation access, that are relatively flat, because industrial businesses are very concerned about having relatively flat sites. So for instance, you had Grain Millers that has bought a piece of land up in Junction City and plans to build their new facility in Junction City on a 100-acre site there. And so they'll eventually be leaving Eugene at the point where they build their facility, or they'll be having some of their operations leave Eugene. Rexius bought a site, I believe, north of Coburg, and they're doing some of their work on the site there because they couldn't find an appropriate site in Eugene. So that's in part why we're looking at some of these larger site sizes. And that brings us to the end of the most important parts of the EOA for what is it that we have and what is it we need. The remainder of the EOA talks about the characteristics of needed sites. So if we don't have land that's available for redevelopment, or that's otherwise available for redesignation, say, if we're looking at an urban growth boundary expansion, what are those sites? What characteristics do they have to have? As I've alluded to, the city has done a lot of measures to increase employment development, and I will opportunities, and I'll turn that over to Heather in a few moments. But they include things like the zoning code amendments that you've worked on, and redesignation and rezones of some land within the urban growth boundary.
Do you have a question, Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, just, again, a question, suggestion. I don't know if this report is completed, considered complete and untouchable, but page 134, if you compare that with all the other places, there's always a table that shows that, so it's very clear. All these other tables, 34, 35, 36, throughout the document. For some reason, that's not in the table, and it just seems unusual to me. You might still have it as text, but you might want to have a table so that it's, people are used to looking at the tables, and they know that that's the important thing to look at, so.
It's a good suggestion, thank you.
Okay, I am going to move on to part 3.
Believe that,
Oh, did you have a question?
I wasn't sure.
Well, you went through all the parts, so I didn't know what you were going to say, Heather. I was going to wait to maybe. My basic question was, when you did this and located what the needs were and where they cited, it's kind of difficult, although you have targeted industries. Was there any thought of how many of the new people coming in will this be, or how many will be residents that are locally to meet this workforce? I know that's really difficult. The second one is where you're citing these particular facilities in the plan to allow for people traveling across the whole city. Did you use your land use for housing around those or close in vicinity to those sites so that people don't have to travel a couple of miles through the city to get to this employment centers? Maybe we'll talk about that when you get to the other chapter. And then the last thing, because I haven't looked at that too intently, is the other big one on residential land study. Is it in a similar format?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
It looked like it was, but I wasn't. Okay, good.
Yeah. Did you have anything you wanted to say, Beth, before in relation to those questions?
So on page 48 of the EOA in table 6, it shows information about where people who work in Eugene lived. And so about 44% of people who worked in Eugene lived in Eugene. About 12% lived in Springfield, and 21% lived in unincorporated Lane County. Frankly, that's not unusual. Eugene has a little bit larger share of people who live and work in Eugene than an awful lot of our Willamette Valley cities do. So your question gets to how do we provide job opportunities for the people who live in Eugene? And there's a piece of that that the city really doesn't have an influence over at a certain level of where people choose to live.
No, I understand that. And if future jobs come in and they have, let's say, a similar pattern, then my other question was related to where reciting goes.
Right.
Are we providing the housing near that to accommodate those?
And those are questions that I'll defer to Heather on.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so going into part 3. So part 1, again, was the 2012 buildable lands inventory. That was how much vacant land we have, how much partially vacant land. We made some estimates about a baseline amount of redevelopment that would happen based on historic trends. The EOA looks at, okay, what's the demand on that land? And then the conclusion section for the EOA, part 2, says, okay, when you compare the supply to the demand, we have a deficit for commercial and for larger industrial sites. Part 3 is another type of demand that we have to consider, and that is public and semi-public uses that happen on employment land. So if we need a stormwater detention facility, or if we need a school, those kinds of things, those are going to probably happen on vacant land, and they're going to take up capacity of land that would have otherwise been used for jobs or for housing, which we address later. So that's what part 3 does, is it takes into account needs from our public service providers, EWEB, city, stormwater, wastewater, and U of O. And when you get to part 3, page 7 in the back, that's where you see table 3 that starts to do the math for you. So it shows you that, again, we haven't gotten to efficiency measures yet here, but it's just saying what's the 2012 buildable land supply, what is our demand, and then what's our public and semi-public demand. And you end up with, on commercial land, you have a deficit of 121 acres, so it went up because we do use some, or we're projected to use some of our employment land for public and semi-public uses. For industrial, less than 10 acres in size, we actually have a bit of a surplus for a small lot industrial, and again, that's what we end up using for our efficiency measures. And then industrial greater than 10 acres, we have a deficit of 11 sites. So then part 4 gets into explaining the measures to increase employment development. So fit more jobs or large sites inside our current urban growth boundary than we would otherwise see if we didn't take any actions. So most of these efficiency measures, in fact, I think all of them, we have already acted on. Creation and application of the E1 and E2 zones, those were intended to provide more commercial office uses, and so those would happen on the smaller lot industrial sites, so take up some of that actually most of that surplus with commercial office jobs, so we would see more of a mixture of industrial and office on there. Downtown and mixed-use code amendments, downtown riverfront, those are really about increasing retail, again, fitting more commercial retail jobs downtown. And then number 5, we're working on, brownfield and parcel assembly are about creating more larger lots to meet some of our deficit for large lot industrial through brownfield cleanup efforts. We got a grant to work on that. There's a program that's already started between us and Eugene, Wayne County, and then also parcel assembly. Are there some smaller lots that we can put together to create larger lots? So then on part 4, page 13, you see our table starts to get longer because now we're saying, okay, what's the 2012 inventory? What's the demand? What's the public and semi-public demand? But then how much capacity do we add back for efficiency measures?
But the footer says Part 4, page 14. Flip back to another tab.
We're still in the employment land
We're still in the
supply.
ECLA study.
The study.
Past page 134, and then it
Yeah.
goes into this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so each part in the employment land supply study has its own numbering for each section, and you'll see that in the footer. So this is where we're just doing the math, and so at the end of each part of the employment land supply, you'll see this table gets longer because it's adding and subtracting.
Part 4, page 13.
Yep. So the result of those efficiency measures is at the top of Part 4, page 13. Under commercial, you'll see that we have a little bit of a surplus, which is probably, a little bit of a surplus roughly of 7 acres because we did those efficiency measures. We fit more jobs in. For industrial less than 10 acres, we ended up with a little bit of a deficit because we used up some of that small lot industrial for the commercial efficiency measures. So you see the 26 acre deficit. And then for industrial greater than 10 acres, you see that we have that 11 site deficit. And then if you go over onto the next page, that fleshes out the deficit for sites that are 10 acres or greater for industrial.
Quick, next question.
Yep.
Two questions or thoughts. The public and civic public land survey, I don't see that you noted any need for roads, and I don't know that any new roads would be required, but you might need to widen the existing roads and get some land for that purpose.
So
I just
I-
wanted, you don't have to answer that, but just. you can
I'm
answer.
happy to. It's just a clarification. Our density assumptions in both housing and jobs account for the fact that some of that land will be taken up by roads.
Okay, and
Yeah.
my other quick question is, it would be worthwhile, well, the concern is if a data warehouse came in there and all of a sudden you needed a large amount of electricity, in other words, right now that's not planned, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to have talk to EWEB and see what additional space would be required to make sure that you have enough buffer in your public lands to cover that. Because that would be the concern. You'd have to put in a new substation and new towers and so forth, and you might need right-of-way and space for that. And, it's not planned because right now EWEB doesn't think, all we're saying is we're going to have some industrial, but we could have a use that would be heavy user of something.
Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, my question was on the 10 acres or less deficit. I don't recall a strategy to address that. Is that someplace else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll just jump into Part 5. So Part 5 is really about how do we make up that deficit for large lots? And we'll talk more about this later, but this is really just acknowledging that we need to expand the urban growth boundary for those large lot industrial. As a result of the expansion for large lot industrial, in order to make and Emily, you might say this better than I am, but by the nature of where we are expanding, in order to make an orderly expansion, there are actually some smaller industrial lots that end up being brought into the urban growth boundary. So we're not expanding for that purpose, but they actually end up being covered because of the way the expansion, to make a rational expansion area.
Okay, thank you.
So Part 5, what you see then, and there's actually a footnote there under so I'm on Part 5, page 2, Table 1. Industrial less than 10 acres in size. At the bottom of that page, there's a footnote about final land supply sufficiency. Footnote number 3 indicates that what I just said, that the expansion takes care of that need, even though that's not why we were expanding. And then part 5, on the back page of that, page 3, it shows, our deficit was 11 sites of large lot industrial. The land supply gained from UGB expansion is 11, so our need is met. And then part 6 pulls it all together into new maps. And that's what Emily was referring to earlier, is that these are the maps that we would rely on when we're looking at what our full inventory is, because it shows the expansion area. We even have a map in the very back of part 6 that shows the Clear Lake area large lot portfolio map. So it's all kind of included there and summed up together there. Any changes in designation as a result of efficiency measures are represented there.
So the only other thing that I would add to that, and it's probably clear to you all, and it's pretty clear on the table, but that, here's the table we were just looking at. The table 4, which is part 4, page 13, and this table you see throughout, because of the nature of the large lot industrial, those are discussed in terms of the number of sites we need, so there's a deficit of 11 sites in those size categories. The other categories, commercial and industrial, less than 10 acres, are addressed in terms of acres. So that 26 deficit is actually just 26 acres, so it's actually a very small deficit of industrial land that we may or may not have had to deal with under the law. It just so happens that in our expansion area, we do cover that and we're able to really meet all of our needs. But it's not 26 sites, so for those people who are listening, I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. It's 26 acres.
Can you please explain, and really it's to help us with public meetings and obviously the public now. So one of the measures to increase commercial, but it looks like commercial employment, so you have the land, the deficit in commercial. Can you please just, I'm looking at this table, and we don't need to get into it, but I just want to, how is the commercial satisfied in terms of that deficit?
So are you on part 4, page 13? Okay. So under commercial, there's a kind of a section that says land supply gained from measures to increase commercial employment. And so the E1 and the E2 codes are new zoning districts that allowed for more commercial office jobs than the I1 and the I2 zones originally allowed. And
So even
by
though they're
allowing-
industrial uses, they are still satisfying? That's
Yes,
really where my
it's a
question, the
mix,
crux of
right.
my
We're
question.
allowing more
So
of
it's
a
not
mix.
pure zone that we're talking about. It's really meeting the inventory in terms of jobs.
a mixture.
A mixture. Okay, so that satisfies it even though it's in an industrial zone.
Well, it's a
Does that make
mixed-
sense?
It's a mixed commercial and employment zone. It's an
Okay.
industrial designation.
Perfect.
That's been acknowledged by the state as implementing that designation.
Okay, perfect. That's what I wanted. Commissioner Jaworski and then Commissioner
Yes, if
Baker.
I understand the chair's question, then taking a look at the E1, there's 47.5 acres and it's a mixed use. Under the monitoring program, if you see it's all built industrial, then you'll have a deficit for commercial. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I just had I'm actually looking back on the map on page 3, I guess, and page
Which
3.
Roman numeral, part 4, page 3?
Part 6, page 3. Sorry. And a couple of things. One is, it might be helpful to have I know there's some sort of airport overlay where you can't really build in that area. And I don't know if that could be dotted in, if that would be of any use to people. The other question I have is, there's this narrow strip on Green Hill Road. You kind of wonder why the expansion didn't go out to the road, because you might assume that some businesses, depending on the parcels, might access this area from Green Hill Road. But I'm not, maybe this has been it's been a while since I looked at these maps, so.
It's a parcel line, and that's actually land owned by the airport.
Okay, that's that's why I think the airport drawing would show that. If you put it as airport land, then it would explain to people why it doesn't go out to the road.
Thanks.
It's the one section of Green Hill Road, not the other, not the lower section, but the upper section.
Commissioner Borowski.
So I'm looking at the map, the last map in that page, and it's the
Can you, just for,
large, I don't know, the last map in the whole section.
okay, perfect.
I don't see the number on it, but it's the
Yep.
figure three.
Figure 3.
And I'm just getting to the question about, you said that those 26 acres, we plan to fill in this expansion area. But the question that I have is, if there's regulations on parceling up all of these things, they're all designed that Lot A can only be 10 to 19s, and there's the Clear Lake Overlay Zone that has specific parameters for subdividing those. Where do you get that 26 acres? How do you get those small lots out of these without violating the parameters in the Clear Lake Overlay Zone?
Good question, and we're going to get there. When Sarah comes up to walk you through the expansion area analysis for industrial, there's a series of maps that looks for this size lot with circles.
Okay.
And then this size lot, and it kind of all adds up to a map with a bunch of circles on it that shows you every possible place you could get the big ones, the medium ones, and the little ones, and we have enough extra little ones to meet that surplus.
Okay.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I also had one other question about that map too, and that is the division between B and C on the lower section, that curved division. And I just wonder about that, because if you look at the parcel drawings, you'd think that you might want to do it sort of a little more conveniently for the property owners. You see, those, the largest parcel is on the bottom left, but you can see that there's two parcels on the upper right, and one of them is going to be, both might have slivers of this other category, which doesn't seem to me, it seems like it might make more sense for it to be straight,
we'll have
even
an
if
explanation of that.
even if it doesn't comply with the property line, but more rectilinear, because that's the way the property would likely, it's unlikely it would be divided that way.
The reason it is, I'll just quickly, the reason it is there's a channel right there that'll have a water quality overlay on it. So that's why it's that way, but we will walk through that, sort of how this map was created when we get to the Clear Lake overlay. And we're almost there, I think. More on the parts of the employment and supply study.
We are on C1, the Public Facilities Plan. C1 and C2 both relate to the Public Facilities Plan. The amendments here are to add projects, and while we're at it, take some off that are completed, just a little bit of a cleanup while we're doing it. But the projects that are added are shown in italic bold, and they are specifically to serve the 20-year needs within and outside our urban growth boundary for growth. So all of our growth needs are actually established with these amendments, not just jobs, parks, and schools, but some of these will obviously serve our residences, because service provision does not discriminate that way. You've got water, it goes to every place in the area. So there's maps that we'd be adding, and they are included behind the tab C2, both for water, wastewater, also stormwater. And these would be maps that we would be adding, I think, to the public services plan, and not trying to actually amend the maps that are in there. So tab D is, we've talked about this one already a couple of times with you. This is a transportation services plan amendment, transportation system plan amendment. As we've mentioned, the city council has yet to take action on our new TSP, which is before them the next couple of months. Assuming they take action and adopt that TSP, the language that we've included in this exhibit would work with the draft that's before them right now. If for some reason they have not, or if they change it in a way that requires us to modify this exhibit, that's what we'll do. So if they have not adopted the transportation system plan, referred to as the 2035 plan, these projects would go into trans plan. And this exhibit would be changed to reflect that.
One more note on that, that I did see council dates for upcoming meetings on the TSP, so you had asked about that. There is a work session coming up at the end of February, and I believe they're still polling for the public hearing date, but that would be early March.
Steve? Oh, I can't do that.
Oh,
Sorry.
Yeah. Commissioner Baker, it's
Yes, I just had a question because in that section, there's like map 1, 2, 3, and map 8. Are we missing some maps?
No, those are the maps. I think we are amending maps that are in there, and
Yeah,
that's
we are.
why.
Those are the ones that need to be
Those are
amended.
just the existing maps that are in that plan that we are amending. So we
Okay.
didn't have to amend 7.
Okay.
We went back and forth. That plan could use a nice update. That plan is getting pretty crusty.
Well, again, if I could just follow up, just as a suggestion, if you had a page in front that said
It said something about that.
that, you know, only maps 1, 2, just so the public doesn't
Yeah.
get confused, you know, just simplify, or the council for the same reason.
That's a good point. We'll have to figure out how to do that. Are you marking that one down? Yeah. Thank you. All right. So the next set is the set you've all been waiting for, which is the code amendments. This group of, actually it's just one, they take up one tab, the Eugene Code Amendments, and there are a number of reasons that we need to amend the code. The code has a lot of references to the Metro Plan as our comprehensive plan. So one of the things that we do a lot in here, a lot of these pages are in here solely because, as you can see on the very first page of this exhibit, we have, in some places, replaced the term Metropolitan Area General Plan with Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan. Sometimes we've been a little bit more generic because we know that we haven't, for example, adopted that part of the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan yet, but we know we're going to. So we've just referred to the comprehensive plan in a more generic way. So as we've gone through the entire code, we have appropriately replaced references to the Metro Plan for the particular context. I will draw your attention to page 3 in the definitions. This is where we explain the concept I just kind of talked through. We've defined the term comprehensive plan, and we've defined the term Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan. The term Metro Plan was already defined, and we've done this in a way to provide some context that we explain here basically that the city is in the midst of taking incremental actions to adopt Envision Eugene Comp Plan and to make corresponding portions of the Metro Plan inapplicable. And during that time, we're using all these terms, and we provide direction to the reader, to the planner, who's ever using it, to, if we say Envision Eugene Comp Plan, that's what we mean. If we say Comp Plan, it could be a reference to either one, and context will control. So you guys are going to have some fun with that for a little while. We will try our very best to help you through that, and we're trying to be very, very explicit as we take actions in the Envision Eugene Plan. We are being very explicit in the Metro Plan corresponding amendment to say which parts of the Metro Plan no longer apply to Eugene. So that's something that may warrant a little of your thought, because this is something that may come up for you guys in the next few years. So I'd like you to kind of take a look at that part, make sure that we've addressed those references in a way that works. The other big piece of this that we're going to have specialized staff come talk to you about is the Clear Lake Overlay Zone. If you turn to page 11.
He just went, he stepped out.
Okay,
Let's step right back in.
You can wind me up. I'll talk about other stuff. Commissioner Baker?
Well, just a suggestion, I would put the growth management study in the definitions just so it's clear that what it applies to.
Where is the growth?
On page 2 at the bottom.
Oh, so that's text that's already in
Okay,
the code.
all right.
We didn't mess with that.
I know, but just to clarify, if it's some study that related to Eugene or all of the metropolitan area, that was just a suggestion so people wouldn't be confused what it applies to. Because you have definitions for the other ones.
Okay.
Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, before you move off of the definitions, will it be cited anywhere? Will it just be understood that when we get into quasi-judicial functions, what the pecking order is relative to, refinement plans and the new comprehensive plan? Because there's been a lot of questions on that.
We've tried to be really clear on that in the text of the Metro Plan amendments themselves and in text of the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan about where all that fits in.
Okay.
And I know that staff have in fact even noted some testimony that they've been getting since these have been produced and may have some recommendations for you after all the public comment has come in to really help clarify that. Because you're right, that has been something we've already heard a fair amount about and it can be really confusing. And there's a lot of misinformation being spread around, I think, about how these things work together and don't work together. And it is up to us to clarify that. So.
And I think that's covered under B1, page I3.
So I wanted to reiterate, just because it's 11:45, I have been letting questions that are really more along the lines that you described of deliberation, specific text changes, et cetera. And I'm wondering, should I be a little, the questions are really relevant, like they discussed, if you have a concern, like Commissioner Borofsky for the meeting today, just for follow-up. But for other items, specific suggestions like to change or add text or organizations, should we just wait as you recommended at the beginning?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take those by email, or we could
Yeah.
round them up after the meeting even.
Perfect. So let's refrain from those kind of comments. That'd be great. Thanks.
So,
He's right next to you.
oh, that was really slick. Yeah. So Zach is here and is the authority on the Clear Lake Overlay Zone. And so we'd like to have him kind of talk through that. Now, the reason we're talking about it here is it is an overlay zone. We're creating it through the text that he's going to talk about. And as we already talked about in earlier actions that Heather mentioned, that zone is also being applied only to the land in the Clear Lake area that's being added to the UGB. So what page does your
Okay.
stuff start on?
So the Clear Lake Overlay Zone looks to be on page 11 of 40 in this particular section, which is tab E, the EC amendments. And we've come before the Planning Commission a couple times before just to provide an update when we were drafting this. Commissioner Mills sat on the subcommittee.
I
Excuse
was
me?
on it too.
Oh, and
Yeah, I was left out, but it's all right. Just wanted to let you know I was on it.
Commissioner
Attended all the meetings.
Taylor was also there.
Yeah, thank you.
along with representatives of the Sustainability Commission, the Human Rights Commission, and some representatives of the Bethel neighborhood as well. The two charges before us were one to preserve the large lots, as you heard Beth Goodman describe in the previous section, and the other was to tackle environmental justice concerns in the Bethel neighborhood that would potentially arise from the additional industrial uses in an area that's already heavily populated with those uses. So I believe there were some questions earlier in the meeting about the subdivision process. Those are laid out, excuse me here, on page 14 of 40. you see that there's some basic preliminary info there under number 1, land division, and then there's 2 options provided. One, the mapped option that's rather prescriptive and takes into account the wetlands, the drainage sloughs, the potential extension of Terry Street and other infrastructure in the area, and then assumes that division will follow very closely to the mapped option that's provided on page 16 of 40. We've also attempted to provide a more flexible option, what we've termed the collaborative option, and that basically assumes that, or doesn't assume it, it provides more flexibility for property owners to work together and do things that were unforeseen to us just based on market realities if development opportunities arise. And then lastly, section 4 there, reducing the minimum lot size, provides a out of sorts for people to subdivide smaller once, smaller than the 10-acre minimum lot, once the larger lots that we've committed to providing as part of this expansion have actually been provided. So we've tried to bake that into the code to allow for that flexibility down the road. The other issue is the environmental justice concerns that have come from those in the neighborhood, and as well as the counselor in the Bethel zone, or in the Bethel ward, excuse me. And going back to, let's see, page 12 of 40, 12 and 13 lay out a couple different options that are proposed. One is a neighborhood applicant meeting, which is something that our code provides for on other development types. So this basically says that a certain threshold of development in the area needs to reach out to your neighbors and let them know what you're doing, what you're proposing as part of your development. And then there are development standards proposed. The 2 main ones that our subcommittee grappled with were separation and outright prohibition. That's fair to say, that based on analysis done in some other states, as well as good information we had from local regulators at LRAPA, we were able to come up with these 2 proposed lists that would still allow certain uses to occur, but only 1,000 feet away from parks and single-family homes or residential areas, and then the other section, which is outright prohibition of certain uses in the entire expansion area. So that's a large overview, but I think the one that gets us close, or fulfills our obligations under the EOA is really the large lot component of the overlay zone.
So I have Commissioner Borowski, Jaworski, Mills, and Baker.
I just have a couple of questions, and in the developmental standards, you reference LRAPA, getting an LRAPA permit, and then in other parts of the thing you say DEQ. I'm just concerned if LRAPA goes away, maybe DEQ or LRAPA, is in that one section there. Because I just, from sitting on the budget committee a few years back, the city of Eugene proposed not funding LRAPA. If it went away, that's gone. So maybe a secondary one there. And then in the performance standards, I'm a little confused on the odors and emissions. If you go and build a building and you have to get, how do you know if you build a $100 million plant and then somebody says, I smell something, do you have to tear the $100 million plant down?
No, the performance standards, section 3, are really speak to code enforcement issues that we don't tackle at the point of a development proposal, but instead give our code enforcement staff the authority to address any sort of nuisance concerns that might arise
So that was actually a big discussion that we dealt with in terms of environmental justice,
yeah.
right? So that actually was part of the circular discussion. Just we didn't want to get into the city of Eugene into a situation in Chapter 9 of land use of actually regulating these things. So being able to use an existing system in place and just passing it through, but having identified in Chapter 9.
And then my last question is, under prohibited use, number M, reconstituted wood products manufactured. What is that?
Reconstituted.
Like a particle board plant.
Yeah, particle board, press board, a lot of the, in our research of the different reports that were out there that was associated with air quality and just a lot of epoxies and things that take place in that process aren't really, they're not very nice to smell. But yes, you're right.
It's out of date, but
We had that conversation too.
Yeah, we
We've
did.
got
I've
to,
had that conversation
Yes.
multiple times. I think you're being too restrictive.
Thank you.
And I have Commissioner Jaworski, and then Mills, and then Baker.
I just had a quick one versus categories and sub-areas. If someone up in the north where there are no, A categories, took a lot and had something left over and said they didn't need it, they created an A up there? Thank you.
that's correct.
Commissioner Mills.
Yeah, Zach, you didn't come to page 17 yet, so I'm assuming I can ask something on page 17, specifically 9.464, relating to that, where the only proposed change is a Metro Plan Comp Plan designation reference. But one of the things I wanted to ask about was when we were being told about land supply and employers lost to lack of land supply. I think Robin knows where I'm going here. Some of the employers have been lost not because of a lack of land, but because of a lack of the ability of the city and the developer to come to an agreement on whether the land can be annexed or not. Even though it's available, it's in the UGB, but it's not annexable or understood to be annexable. And to me, that's an efficiency measure that's critical to making the marketability of these properties effective. And this is not the time, I understand, for changes, but I don't know if I'll get another chance to suggest we need to do something here. And I know there's law.
Yeah, it's a
that's
matter
called-
of getting the legislature to change the laws that apply to us now. When we had the ability to annex before the Boundary Commission went away, a lot more land than we do now. When the Boundary Commission went away, we're now unable to annex anything that doesn't touch our current city limits in some way, shape, or form. Now, we bend over as far as we can, to find ways to offer annexation, even when it comes to using rights of way to get to somebody who's ready to develop. But it is an issue, and it's one that the State Department on Land Use, DLCD, they have nothing to do with annexation. In all the land use stuff, annexation is never mentioned, which we have a real problem with because it absolutely controls the pace at which growth can occur. So one of the things that we have done, and Sarah may talk to you about in our expansion study, is we looked at that. We were not willing to just take land that was so far flung, we didn't think that it could reasonably be thought to annex in the next 20 years. But it does tie our hands a bit, for sure. And I guarantee you I'm as frustrated as you are about it. Getting back to the Clear Lake, there are a couple of things that I wanted to mention about that, unless if anyone has any more questions about that.
Yeah, there's one more question, Commissioner
Clear
Baker.
Lake?
Yeah. So I'm going to come back about this curved dividing line between B and C, and I just make a quick comment. There are a lot of industrial campuses that since I worked in Seattle for many years remotely and was there a lot in Portland, a lot of industrial campuses actually appreciate a water course. They use it for recreational, a walk along the, so I just mentioned that you might want to reconsider the configuration because I don't think that actually would be a hardship. It might be an amenity to a number of companies.
Well, that's good, because I think we've said it has to stay there, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't have a walk next to it.
Right, yeah, no.
You know,
And you're saying, so I understand, that a large site could straddle that feature?
a large strike could satellite feature, and the developer would actually use it as an amenity to the project.
Sarah's probably over there just ready to answer these questions. It's not her turn yet, though. So a couple things I wanted to mention about the Clear Lake stuff. We're obviously having you adopted as an amendment to the Eugene Code. It, though, will apply, so we apply this upon, like right away, right? Not just upon annexation.
That's correct.
And it is going to need to be adopted by Lane County. So what, we have this agreement with Lane County that Eugene staff takes care of all of the land use applications and all the process and everything, all the way out to the urban growth boundary. So for that reason, Lane County adopts its own version. It adopts the Eugene code to apply in expansion areas. But they haven't updated their code for some time, the version of the code they've adopted. And instead of taking such a big bite of having them adopt, re-up and adopt the entire Eugene code to apply in all of the areas in the urban growth boundary, because what we're doing right now is so limited to expanding the UGB and dealing with the employment issues, particularly in the expansion area, what we're requesting is that Lane County adopt this new code, but have it only apply in the expansion areas. Until they're ready and we're ready to do the kind of public outreach, it would be new code applying in every part of the urban growth boundary. So just letting you know that, because you'll be doing some deliberations and hearings with Lane County, the main takeaway in that is that this stuff would apply only to the expansion area, and these provisions wouldn't apply to everything in the urban growth boundary. Also, I wanted to note some provisions in the code amendments that are on page 19. Having had a lot of contact and concerns that we wanted to address from the nearby Junction City Water Control District, we've recommended for you, and we've included in this packet, some provisions that require the development of the expansion area to have some consultation with Junction City Water Control District to make sure that their flood control system doesn't get overwhelmed by impervious surface water. We don't see that as an issue, but in order to make sure that they're comfortable with what happens, we're partnering with them in getting a referral and looking at the development that happens out there when it's in process. And finally, on page 28, you see a bunch of new text. And this is the process for amending the new Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan, which you will do quite shortly after you adopt it. Once you have a new plan, you need to be clear about how to make changes to it, and that's what this is. None of this is going to look too unusual to you. It's usually your regular, it's their type 5 process or type 4 process, depending on what they're doing. So those are the highlights of what's in the code changes.
Can I ask a quick question? So I understand, and the reason, it's just to clarify for everyone, because I don't want people to feel like they shouldn't ask questions, but just going back to what Emily said, this is what's going to be in front of us when we deliberate. So that's why holding our specific question, just asking questions about content is relevant, but things that really need to be done during the deliberations, those are the things we need to wait. So going back to Commissioner Mills' question, is this something that we can give? It really seems like a deliberations question also, but is there a way we can prep or talk to Lane County in advance? Do they have any tools or mechanism to address this annexation situation from a county perspective? Do you understand where I'm going with this? So have you had those discussions? Would they be prepared to or could we prepare them to potentially talk about that during deliberations? Because I think that it could be a great partnership, that if there was an opportunity to develop that didn't meet the annexation criteria, maybe Lane County can somehow satisfy it. I know it's complicated, but I just wanted to bring it up in advance of deliberation.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand your question. It's not one I could answer now, even if I wanted to, but I want to make sure I get it. So in other words, if there was a development that met our needs,
But leapfrog.
but we couldn't annex it because of state law,
Yeah.
could we somehow equip the county to provide the services or do whatever? Yeah, yes, we can. We can talk to them, I should say. Probably not in the context of this. It's
Okay.
been an ongoing discussion to a certain degree, because what we do is we have a process for doing that through annexation agreements. But they tend to be, what it means is they sign on and say, okay, you can annex, you can develop now. When we're able to annex you, you won't fight about it. They don't want to annex one at a time. Sometimes there can be difficulties with it. So we won't get too far into that, but do I understand your question right?
Yeah, you do. Thank you for explaining the complexity. Commissioner Randall and then Commissioner
The
Borowski.
problem with that is until they annex, they don't get the zone change. So what they're wanting to develop probably isn't allowed in an ag zone.
Well,
Well,
the
that's what I'm
question.
saying.
Could the county
That's
have
what I'm saying. The county could potentially, yes. What measures could the county potentially do to take advantage of that? Commissioner Borowski and then Commissioner Baker.
I just had a question on page 28 about adjustment review and just how that works. So if they meet all of those A, B, C, D, and E, then it's a planning director's decision whether or not to allow for adjustments.
That's correct, yes.
And then what would the policy be if somebody wanted to appeal that? Or if you could just kind of walk me through that section a little bit more so I'm clear on it.
So actually I have to ask everybody to flip back then to page 14, which lays out the sections of the Clear Lake Overlay Zone which are allowed to be adjusted. And you can see there the different sections that are called out. So you're allowed to adjust the different development standards. Primarily the one that received a lot of focus was the separation requirement. If you're able to fulfill those criteria that you could move closer than the 1,000-foot separation, let's say. But yes, that would ultimately, it's a planning director's decision. If that gets appealed, it goes to the hearings official for review.
Type 2 land use.
Okay. And would prohibited uses be in that as well? Or the, I see the setback ones, but prohibited use, no. Okay.
Development standards and the performance standards.
The performance standards, okay.
Not the uses.
So not the prohibition and not the lot size, since that's one of those issues that fulfills the large lot
And not stormwater.
commitment.
Okay.
So, the next two tabs we've already talked about. Zone changes and overlay zone changes, those are the maps that show what's set out on the table that Heather discussed.
Can I interrupt really quickly? Sorry, Emily. Commissioner Baker had a question
Just a
on the last.
quick thought about the annexation. I'm wondering if there's any possibility to look at the airport and consider it some kind of special relationship so that that would at least allow you to annex from that side in if there was agreement with the state and Lane
To
County.
consider that adjacency, you mean?
Yeah, yeah, just a thought.
Commissioner Borowski.
I just there was some references to a circle map. Can you tell me where that is?
That's coming up next.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready to move forward. Thanks, Emily.
Real quick, I just wanted to point out, because there have been a number of questions about coordination with Lane County, that their staff planner on this project is in the room, Mark Russ, tracking this. We've been collaborating with him, so he's a resource too if you have questions. Okay.
So the next tab is tab H, and this tab deals with the city's work to identify and evaluate and apply protections where necessary for natural resources in the expansion areas. So the city went ahead and took additional steps that aren't required for an urban growth boundary amendment and hired consultants and did some of our own work to determine where the natural resources are in the expansion areas, particularly because we needed to make sure that the land identified in the Clear Lake area could be developed, despite the fact that there are a lot of wetlands out there. The wetlands themselves were delineated, and you can talk to staff about specifically what was done to identify them and look at them, but there's a new local wetlands inventory for the area that will be ready to be adopted through the state. And the Goal 5 process, which is left to the city and county in this area, is what results in this amendment to our local water resources conservation plan. So the city looked at wetlands and natural and habitat areas and evaluated them under state standards and determined that for the most part, they're not wetlands, Terry can talk about this more, that warrant protection. In other words, they could be filled if the state says they can be filled. They don't rise to the level of what we protect, for example, in our West Eugene Wetlands Plan and based on our standards. They're largely agricultural sites that have been plowed over and that are not high value. So this action would amend our local plan to have our work on that front be basically done, and so that the city would not be an obstacle to development where these areas are identified for no protection. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it would be a good time to show you a little bit more information about the wetlands, because there is a whole consultant's report under findings. So the I tab, findings, appendix B, it says I findings, app B, employment expansion. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not it.
Are you talking about
F Goal 5, yes, is the Goal 5 documentation, the findings. So this is where you would find those maps that the consultant did looking at the wetlands. There's a couple pages of that. And then there's a document called Goal 5 EC analysis. And that's an acronym from the state law that stands for environmental, social, economic, and equity. And it's a balancing analysis that is kind of like our triple bottom line framework that looks at the costs and benefits or pros and cons of protecting resources versus allowing them to be developed for economic development. So this whole study looks at those, and I'm going to point you to one map within the study. It's page 51 of the EC analysis, and it's a color map labeled Clear Lake UGB expansion area, EC analysis. Somewhere on it, it says concept map. There it is, concept plan, large employment site feasibility. So this map is a potential way, because we were interested in testing the feasibility of actually creating these lots, given that there are wetlands in this area. So this is our consultant's exploration of that feasibility, and it's one way that the city could meet its portfolio of large sites with certain wetlands being approved for fill by the state and federal agencies, certain ones being filled and mitigated on site, and certain ones being mitigated off site. So there's a whole series of assumptions that flow through this, but this is because we were interested in testing this feasibility. This is one way that it could be done to kind of prove that our strategy has a way forward. We wanted to test that. There's lots more we could say about this, but there's an executive summary of this report. If you have questions about wetlands and where the information is, it's in this document. So familiarize yourselves with that.
And
That's all I
finally,
want to say about it.
so then we move into the findings. The first number of pages in the findings, the first 65 pages, are standard findings like you are used to seeing that address all of the criteria that apply to the many kinds of decisions that are made by through the ordinance. Because there are pretty hefty requirements under some of these findings have a bunch of appendices, and that's what follows the findings. Testimony that you hear really to be most valid would refer to one of the sections that's referenced in this first bunch. So, this addresses all of the applicable code standards, all of the administrative rule standards, everything from statute all the way into the statewide planning goals. So that takes you through the first, as I said, 65 pages. On page 65, there's a little table of contents to the appendices that follow. And I think we can have Sarah come up and talk about these now, yeah?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. And so, because I know we only have about 15 more minutes, and as you can see, the appendices are quite lengthy and a good chunk, what I'd like to start with is an overview of how the first four really fit together, because they link into each other in pretty important ways. And then as time allows, we can get into more detailed questions about implications, and that can probably carry over into next week's session? Right. Okay. So the first four appendices to the findings are Appendix A, school expansion, which is relatively slim compared to some of the other ones. Appendix B, employment expansion, which is quite large. Appendix C, park expansion. And then Appendix D is the addendum to the UGB expansion analysis for employment land. And so the school expansion starts with looking at, as we've established in the employment land supply study and all of the other analysis before, that sets up how much land we need for various uses. And then use by use, we go through and look at where that land needs or is best able to be accommodated through an expansion when an expansion is needed. So the school expansion, this first expansion, begins with some introductory text, really looks at what is the context, what is the need, and then it dives into what are the site characteristics, how have we established that need, and then goes through an analysis that we can go through in more detail once we've gone through sort of the set of what is the best place to meet that need. That expansion study ends with, okay, these are the parcels that we think are the best based on our analysis for an expansion. And then those parcels are sort of set and assumed as you go through future studies. So when you look at the employment land study, you will see those school parcels already sort of set aside and not analyzed for double use. If that makes sense. Okay. The employment expansion studies go through a slightly different process because of the employment land supply study. So a lot of the things that are evaluated in detail through the economic opportunities analysis and through other studies are existing in this packet. And so the school expansion study and also the park expansion study have to do that within the study. But the employment expansion study refers back to the employment land supply study in lieu of having it in the study itself. The employment expansion study also looks at a much wider area because it's not immediately restrained to this park area or this school district. So a big part of why it's such a larger document is just there's a lot more land that has to be analyzed in order to do that. And then the employment land supply study, again, ends with a particular area being identified, and then that sort of gets tabbed and set aside, and then we go into parks. And so once you get into the park study, you'll see school land and employment land set aside, not reevaluated, but those sort of noted areas set aside as we evaluate parks land. Then we get into the addendum, and the addendum is kind of a different thing, which is why I wanted to set up those three initial studies before we talk about the addendum so that it makes more sense. So the addendum says, okay, in the employment land supply study. We've gone through, we've identified the area that we think holds the most promise and best meets our need for an employment expansion as established the need for in the employment land supply study. But we also know that there have been additional concerns in terms of wetlands was a very large one. There is also sort of future transportation needs and actual functional developability of this area. And so we wanted to take a second look at the Clear Lake expansion area for employment, taking into account more information than we have for the entire expansion study. And so because we're looking at it through a different lens, it's sort of a separate document specifically in order to address additional information that we don't have for the full expansion study. And the addendum is where we look at the small industrial need, those sort of extra little pieces that had to be a part of the large lot expansion, and so they fill that need. So that's where that particular information comes into play. It also looks at the wetlands and what is specifically being protected, and so that addresses Commissioner Baker's specific question about that curvy line and sort of where that comes from and how that fits in with tax lot lines. So all of that is in the addendum, but it's hard to get to the addendum before you go through the first three studies. So that's sort of the overall layout of those first four appendices. Any question about that sort of high level, the four appendices and how they fit together as a set? Okay. So then going back to the school study, so Appendix A, we'll dive into this one in a little bit more detail, and this is the simplest of the four studies, so it's also a nice sort of framework in terms of how they're all laid out. So with the introduction, you look at, okay, what is the school system? What are the overall laws that need to be evaluated? How does all of that come together? And then we look at Section 2, determination of need for a new school site. What information did we look at to say, do we actually need a school site? How did we decide in the absence of something like the employment land supply study? But just referencing Eugene 4J's plans and the Bethel School District long-range plans, how we established the need for a school at all. And then we get into the characteristics, which are also established primarily through Bethel's long-range plan. And so that is the second section and the third section. And those are pretty closely mirrored in the park study coming up. So the school study and the park study are pretty lockstep, which makes them nice companions. So at the end of section 3? Yes, at the end of section 3, you have this summary of here's what we're looking for in a school site. And so that is on page 5 of Appendix A. And then we say, okay, so we've established what we need for a school. Can we meet that need inside the existing urban growth boundary? And so this is a section that does not occur in the employment study, but it does occur in both parks and schools. And so we look at the specific site characteristics that are needed, and then how much land that could potentially meet that is in the UGB, and establish that we cannot, in fact, meet the need inside the UGB, so we have to look outside of it. So that's what Section 4 looks at.
I had a couple of questions.
Do you want to pause and take
Sure,
questions
yeah.
or go through? So
Absolutely.
I have Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, I'm just going to raise an issue that we
Yeah.
discussed a ways back on this, and that is, it just seems to make more sense if there would be a land swap between Bethel School District and the Parks District for the land, if you look at the map.
Commissioner Baker, can I make a suggestion that you either follow up with staff afterwards or
I
keep
just
this
wanted
for
to mention that to
deliberations?
be considered in terms of the going forward.
Thank you. Commissioner Borowski.
My question, just kind of, I'm just throwing it out there, is if we're looking at needs for schools going forward 20 years, and we approached Bethel and we approached 4J, was there also any thought to that the nature of schools may be changing over the next 20 years with charter schools and other types of alternative schools? It just kind of came to my head, that schooling may change and there may be needs for schools that aren't identified by 4J or others. Is that?
I think the studies that we looked at particularly focused in on the established need of 4J based on their current projections and the capacity of their schools, and doesn't necessarily look at other, which tend to be sort of hypothetical changes in the school system. And so we have opportunities to potentially evaluate that.
It was
As that
it was
comes.
just a question because there is all talk about changing ways of schools.
Commissioner Jaworski.
When they did this, they took in the location of the school site where they thought the growth was going to occur based on all the criteria in this.
So what it looks at in terms of, are you asking about how they established the site characteristics that they were
How they
looking for?
established that the site was there. I mean, I know they look at whatever their thing is and say, we're going to need a school here because they're not meeting demands. But when you look 20 years in the future, they have to understand your land use because they're going to say, well, where is the growth going to occur? We'll need a, so are they saying that all the growth is going to occur up here? I can see the employment occurring up there, but you're saying the growth is going to occur there and that's why they need a school there.
So this gets a little bit into details, but if you go, no, it's, I think if it's,
Yeah, I think
it's, yeah. Just sort of prepping you for, I'm going to dig down a little bit in order to answer your question. So I don't think it's a bad question by any means, but so on page 4, this addresses that question. This shows a map of Bethel School District overlaid onto the current UGB. Page 4 of Appendix A, yeah. And so all the little colored squares inside are their current facilities. These are all of the schools that they currently have. And so the way that they established the sort of general area that they feel needs to be a general location for the school is not necessarily based on very tight look at where growth is going to occur, but looking at over the course of their entire district. School facilities have to be inside the UGB. So even though a large portion of Bethel School District is outside of the urban growth boundary itself, the facilities have to be inside the urban growth boundary. And so looking for something, you can see that they established Barger Drive and Terry Street as two sort of streets that kind of contained the vast majority of their existing schools. And looking at the distribution of their population, that additional space that is north of Barger and east of Terry, west of Terry, I'm losing my directions, thank you, west of Terry, was identified as an area that isn't currently served and has a large portion of their area.
I understand.
Okay.
That's not what my question was.
Okay.
I call that existing. My question was, is if 30,000 people are coming in, based on our land use patterns, did you take where they might go, and is there a need for a school there? That's what I'm asking.
So the way that they addressed that particular question is looking at more the capacity of the schools that they have and how close to capacity what they have are compared to the facilities that they have. And so the specific number of additional students that they could is by no means sort of the 34,000 additional residents, but they have a number that is cited in here.
Okay, so they look at existing, not where a future growth may be. That's all I wanted to ask.
Yeah, so it's sort of a hybrid between the number of students that they expect to see and their district geography.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Awesome. So once those site characteristics are established through that study and we define that we can't find that particular type of land inside the UGB with what's available, then we go into section 5, which is the largest section, which actually goes through the full analysis of the area. So it sets up a study area, which is the map on page 10, which looks at the overlap of the Bethel School District and our study area that is established looking at, and there's sort of the criteria for it. So within Bethel School District boundaries, I'm on page 10, the text next to the map, within 1/2 mile of the current UGB, or beyond 1/2 mile of the UGB if it's also within the Metro Plan boundary. And then even past that for exception areas or non-resource land, which doesn't happen to apply in this particular area. So that says this is all of the land that is potential for us to look at because it's in Bethel School District, which is necessary for a Bethel School District facility, and is within our study area of what we think is within the range of how we could expand the UGB. And then we get into the priority categories for the state of Oregon, which divides all land into basically 4 different priorities that you have to evaluate in order. So the first priority land is urban reserves. And we don't have any of that because we don't have an established Eugene urban growth boundary. So we can't have an urban reserves program until we set that boundary. So that is not a type of land that we have available to look at, although we hope to and intend to. And then second priority land, and you can read all of these definitions, and it's very prescriptive by the state. On page 11 is land that is an exception area or non-resource land, including resource land that is completely surrounded by exception areas. And if you turn to the next page, this sort of walks through the creation of those priorities through a series of maps that might be more useful than just the text. So you start with the land use designations on page 12, and then you translate those land use designations into priority land. So you can see the airport becomes priority 2 land. Even though it's fully developed, that is where it fits within how we evaluate it.
Sarah wanted to do a quick time check. We're a couple minutes over.
Okay. I might just talk about this map and then wrap things up. Thank you. And so within this map, what you can see is on page 13, we have a fair bit of priority 2 land that's in different pockets. The majority is priority 4, which is farmland and forest land. Priority 3 is something that we do have in the southern portion, but it is not in this particular area, so it's just marked as none. And then other lands are lands that through legal process just sort of fall out. Like in this case, we have the airport reserves. Doesn't actually fall into any particular category. And so this process gets followed through all of these different studies where we look at what land is available in a particular study area and what order are we going to look at it. And so from there I can pick up next week and talk about the process through that.
Thank you. Are there any questions before we close? Okay. Thank you. We look forward to next week. Are there any
Actually,
remain?
2 weeks. just
2 weeks, you're right.
clarify
Yeah, thank you for,
you all
thank
and
you.
the public. So you'll pick back up with where we are in the school expansion study on the 13th, and then go on to employment expansion study, the comp plan, which we failed to go through, and the residential proposal.
Perfect.
Thanks. You guys got through a lot today.
Thank you. Okay, that adjourns the commission today.